There you go. Now you can hear me, right? All right. Good morning and welcome to this week's Flight Crit Friday. For those of you that are just tuning in, my name is Sean and I am your host. We're going to wait for a little bit for people to pop in and then we'll get started. All right. I got my coffee. Do more. Couldn't agree more. All right. Hopefully that continues to give you some decent audio. If I end up, if the audio quality is not good, hopefully somebody who is on the broadcast today will chime in and let me know, and I will get that squared away. Well, I sure hope everyone is doing well today on this Friday, August 7th. What happened to the month already? It's we're already a week into August. I can't believe that. All right. I know that I had a number of people that were intending to hop on the call and actually participate today. So I am going to just kind of wait a little bit and then we're going to get going. I see I got 2 viewers on right now. That's great. Super excited about that. Good morning. Let me see if I can bring up the Q&A tab and also the chat tab. So if you are just tuning in and you are not actually on the call, because I don't have anybody on the call just yet, I got 3 people who are viewing it. If you can, over in the group chat, go ahead and over here on this side of your screen, I do believe, just leave me a little message. Let me know who is on, who is watching. And yeah, hopefully we get some of our people that are going to be actually in on the call popping up here pretty quickly. Okay, let's see. So today's topic is flight physiology. This is part 1 of a 14-part series I'm going to be doing on preparing for the flight paramedic exam. We're going to be going over all of the categories that are covered on the FPC, and one at a time, breaking it down. I'm not going to be covering every little detail of each category, but I am going to be giving you the key stuff that you need to know to be successful. And of course, it'll be up to you to do more preparing on your own. If you are looking for some additional assistance in getting ready for the exam, I encourage you to come over to flightcrit.com and you can sign up for my one-on-one coaching. I am also in the process of creating a 16-week course or a 16-module course that you'll be able to participate in. You can sign up, you'll be able to download it from the website, and you can either download the individual modules or you can download the entire course, and it'll be yours. So look for that in the future. If you are interested in that, sign up for my email newsletter. You can do it on my website, and I will I'll let you know when that is available. It's coming soon. I don't have an exact release date or launch date, but it is going to be coming. So let me go ahead and send a quick message out to the people who are hoping to be actually in on the call, and then we'll get this party started. Okay. Beautiful. Okay. Well, hopefully Hopefully we get people popping up. I do know that I can see that there are some people watching. I don't know if you're on the website or if you're on YouTube or if you're viewing it from Google. If you're able to, I'd love to have you drop me a message in the chat box and let me know, where are you watching this from? Are you watching it from the website or what? So, okay. Well, we're about 6 minutes in. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, welcome. Again, I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Sean Eaton. I am a flight paramedic and critical care paramedic. I fly in northern New Mexico, and I live in Colorado. And I am your host of any number of different sites where you can follow me. My primary site is flightcrit.com. And I also have a Google page, Google group. I'm all over the place. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and Periscope is what I've been doing a lot recently. So if you are interested in getting short little Flight Crit Fridays, if you will, short little broadcasts, I encourage you to go over to Periscope, download the app to your smartphone, and follow me at Flight Crit. #FlightCritLive. So here we go. Today, flight physiology. We're going to be going over the 8 stressors of flight. We're going to be talking about hypoxia, which is one of the 8 stressors of flight, but we're going to be diving into hypoxia pretty heavily. We're going to be talking about the gas laws, and we're going to go over all of the gas laws with the exception of a couple that really are irrelevant to what we do. And then we will be kind of diving in deep to a couple of the gas laws that are really important for the exam that you absolutely have to know in order to be successful at this test. We're also going to be, and then at the end, I'm going to touch on a couple other items that I have seen and people have told me about showing up on their flight paramedic exam. And so that's what we're going to be covering today. I hope that this is helpful. Once this broadcast is done, this will be live. You can go back on YouTube. And I am also going to be creating a little PDF document that you can get by coming over to the website, and you can download the PDF document, which is basically my notes for this lecture. All right. Without further ado, if you were hoping to actually get in on the discussion, send me a message through the question in the Q&A tab for Google Hangouts or on the chat board, and I will send you a link to participate, because as of right now, we have nobody who is in the actual call right now. You could also tweet me if you're having problems, and I will see that pop up, and I'll send you an invite. Okay, here we go. Flight physiology. It is, if you look at the Board of Critical Care Transport Paramedics outline for the exam, it is the first category, and it's probably, I don't know exactly how many questions are on the exam pertaining to flight physiology, but it's one of the larger categories. If you are preparing for the certified critical care paramedic exam, this stuff is not going to be on that exam, although it is still really good information. Okay, there are 8 stressors of flight that you need to be aware of. The first one being hypoxia. The second one being, excuse me for a moment, thermal changes in the flight environment. The third one being vibration. Fourth one being dehydration. And we have noise, fatigue, and G-forces. And so those are the broad categories that we're going to be covering on today's broadcast. All right. So hypoxia. Hypoxia is broken into 4 different types. And there will be questions on the exam that say something to the effect of, your patient is suffering these effects, what type of a hypoxia might this be? So the 4 types are hypoxic hypoxia, hypemic hypoxia, stagnant hypoxia, and histotoxic hypoxia. And you can probably figure out what some of those mean just by the names. So the first one we're going to talk about is hypoxic hypoxia. We'll go over that one pretty quickly because I think for the most part, most people understand hypoxia. But just to recap, hypoxia is the inadequate tissue perfusion at the cellular level, or tissue perfusion at the cellular level, excuse me. It's also known as altitude hypoxia because in the flight environment, that is the primary cause for this type of hypoxia. You take a patient who is already compromised, you take them up to altitude where the partial pressure of oxygen is lower, and suddenly you've got a patient who's suffering from hypoxia because they're not unloading the oxygen quite as well as they had before. This type of hypoxic hypoxia, is what we call an exchange problem. It's a problem with the oxygen exchange across the tissue, the alveolar and capillary membrane. Like I said before, it primarily results from a drop in barometric pressure associated with altitude. It can also result from low FiO2 states. So you've got a patient who is already compromised, and they're on a ventilator, and you just don't have high enough FiO2, or their metabolic demand is requiring higher concentrations of oxygen, and you're not supplying it. Other things that we may not really consider as being contributors to hypoxic hypoxia would be things like a pneumothorax, pneumonia, pulmonary emboli. They fall into this category when we're trying to classify hypoxia for flight physiology. And like I said before, it's just anything that interrupts the exchange of oxygen. Okay, got that? No questions? There is a question feature here on Google Hangouts. So if you have questions, you can type them in on the left-hand side, right-hand side of your screen. You can type in a question, and it'll pop up, and I'll be able to answer your question. Okay. All right. Next type of hypoxia is your hypemic hypoxia, and this is a transport problem. This is a problem where we just can't simply move the oxygen that's coming into the lungs from the capillary bed out to the tissue. Primary cause of this, as you can imagine, might be blood loss. Okay. Other causes would be things like anemia, or low H&H, anything of that sort, and then red blood cell malformation. So the primary one I can think of is sickle cell. Anything that basically prevents the oxygen from being transported out to the tissue. Okay. Assuming we don't have some of these other factors that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So hypemic, Hypemic, hypemic hypoxia. And that's a transport problem. Okay, the next one is stagnant hypoxia. And as you can imagine, as the name implies, that is just a loss of flow problem. And that could be from a number of reasons. But the main thing to take home, the main thing to consider is that the blood is just not moving forward. All right, we've got a question here. Let's see. What do we got here? Excuse me for a minute. All right, Jason. Well, thank you for your question, or thank you for your comment here. Hopefully you can get your stuff resolved. and we'll move on. But if you're able to continue to stay in the queue and watch, please do. Otherwise, like I said at the beginning, you'll be able to go back and watch the broadcast through YouTube, and I will share that out at the end with all of our participants. So thanks a lot. Okay. So going back to stagnant hypoxia, this is just anything that's preventing blood from moving forward. Some of the causes of stagnant hypoxia would be low cardiac output. So you've got a patient who's in cardiogenic shock, they're septic, anything like that, bradycardic from whatever, could be drug overdose, but anything that's reducing your cardiac output. Okay. Excessive positive pressure ventilation, that will also reduce your cardiac output. Remember, by increasing your intrathoracic pressure, you reduce your preload and thus cardiac filling, and therefore your cardiac outflow is reduced, and so is your cardiac output. Sepsis causing blood pooling with a massive vasodilation. Again, you get a decrease in afterload, and decrease in afterload also decreases your cardiac output. So anything that's going to prevent blood from moving forward. Compartment syndrome is also a potential cause. If you've got that constriction, then you don't have return of blood back to the heart, and that can cause the stagnant hypoxia as well. Isolated stagnant hypoxia within that region. Similarly, extended crush situations where you've got a patient who's pinned, maybe they're in a car, building collapse, trench collapse, whatever, where you've got that crush syndrome or that crush situation where it's tamponading the extremity and preventing blood flow. Similarly, a massive pulmonary embolism, or not pulmonary embolism, but massive DVT. I've had a patient with a occlusion of the descending aorta right at the bifurcation of the femoral veins, not descending aorta, the vena cava, the inferior vena cava, right at the bifurcation of the femoral veins. And essentially, this patient was completely occluded from the waist down, had a lactate of over 20, and as you can imagine, did not do very well. And then venous pooling from inactivity. That's why we get these patients who are who develop blood clots and pulmonary embolisms, because they've been sitting in a car for 5 hours. So another cause for that stagnant hypoxia. And then last is the histotoxic hypoxia, and this is basically poisoning. This is a problem with usage. The oxygen is there; it just cannot be used for any number of reasons. Carbon monoxide is bound to the hemoglobin, and we think a lot about carbon monoxide binding to the hemoglobin and then preventing the onloading of oxygen. But what it also does is it triggers a change in the hemoglobin, so that what oxygen it is binding, it holds on to tighter. And so the oxygen's there. It may not be sufficient, but the oxygen is there. It's bound to the hemoglobin, but the hemoglobin just won't it won't offload that oxygen to the tissue, and so it causes hypoxia. Cyanide is another cause. Cyanide interrupts that last step in the electron transport chain, and so that can cause some hypoxic complications at the tissue level. And then, of course, other poisoning. And then I just mentioned smoking because, in EMS, there seems to be so many people who smoke, and, they're just they're causing themselves hypoxia. All right, so those are the four stages of hypoxia. Just to recap, we've got the histotoxic, stagnant, hypemic, and hypovolemic. Okay. Some of the early signs of hypoxia tend to be hunger and fatigue. And, this can really be a challenge in the flight environment because we're used to working long shifts. Many of us are working 24s, 48-hour shifts. I even know some services that allow their crews to work 5, 6, 7 days straight. And that's just insane to me. I work 48s, and sometimes we are just slammed, and I am so exhausted. And even when I am well rested, I've had a quiet night. I've been able to sleep all night, and I'm well rested. Get that flight, and suddenly I'm yawning and thinking, wow, this is so strange. Why am I yawning? I had a great night's sleep. Hypoxia. Okay. The base I fly at starts out at above 7,000 feet. And we're regularly flying at 12, 13, 14,000 feet, even 15 or 16,000 feet from time to time. And so, I constantly have to remind myself that, hey, we're at altitude. I'm probably going to be a little hypoxic. And that may be why I'm tired. Same with hunger. We try to eat, try to keep ourselves well nourished. But if, for whatever reason, you start noticing you're fatigued, you're tired, that might be some early signs of hypoxia. So you might need to consider that. Maybe throw on a non-rebreather yourself. Take some really good deep breaths, and then see, reevaluate and see if you need to abort or need to change your flight plan. All right. So hypoxia is broken up into 4 stages. And these stages are generally divided up by altitude, because we are talking flight physiology. We're talking about different stages of hypoxia as they are associated with the flight environment. So the first stage of hypoxia generally occurs between sea level and 10,000 feet. This is called the indifferent stage. And generally, most people are able to compensate without any problems, without any real symptoms within this stage of hypoxia. It may not even be noticeable. If there are symptoms, they're probably going to be mild tachycardia, mild fatigue, maybe a little bit of increased respirations, but that's really going to depend on the individual. If you come from sea level and now you're flying a patient up and over a range, and you're at 8, 9, 10,000 feet, you're probably going to feel the effects of that. Where I used to work back east, we were a couple hundred feet above sea level. But if I happen to do a transport to the western part of the state, I could very easily be up at 6, 7, 8,000 feet, and I would notice that. Something to note, if you're flying under goggles, and I think most services are, night vision starts to be degraded at as low as 5,000 feet MSL. Okay, let's think about that. Where I'm flying, like currently, we're starting off at 7,000 feet. Now, most people acclimate to that. Where I live, I'm above 5,000 feet, but already my night vision is being degraded. So the parameters, the capabilities of the night vision goggles that are advertised by the manufacturer are already less. So those are things that we need to keep in mind when we're doing seam flights and we're going into an unfamiliar LZ. We're under goggles. Our night vision is already going to be degraded if we're above 10,000 feet. And then, like I said, mild fatigue. Okay, the next stage of hypoxia is the compensatory stage. This generally occurs between 10,000 and 15,000 feet. This is the stage where most people are able to compensate, but you're probably going to start to notice some symptoms associated with the altitude. I know that where I live here in Colorado, we have a lot of 14,000 plus foot peaks, and even though I spend a lot of time at 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet, when I go up and I'm exerting myself and I'm up on top of those peaks, I feel it. Some of the things that I start to notice, I can tell that I'm breathing faster. My heart rate is up. I'm feeling more tired. I remember the first couple times I went up and did some 14ers, I started to notice that I was a little more fatigued. My judgment was a little bit off. I found myself doing simple math problems just to try and make sure that I wasn't becoming too hypoxic and too affected by the altitude. But my coordination was a little off. I was walking slower. So those are things that we need to keep in mind. If we're up at high altitude in an unpressurized cabin, then these are the things that are going to affect our ability to care for our patient. Especially if we're taking care of a complicated patient, we're going to have to be thinking about, doing drug calculations and vent changes and monitoring balloon pumps. And, is the timing right? Are we having a problem with the pump? If we have an in-flight emergency, you got to make quick decisions. And all of these high-level decision-making functions are going to be degraded due to the altitude. And keep in mind your ability to compensate for these stages of hypoxia. Your ability to compensate for hypoxia is affected by your physical conditioning. How fast have you ascended? So if you're used to working at 5,000 feet or less, 1,000 feet, and now you've taken a patient, you've rapidly climbed up over a mountain range, and you're going to have to maintain that elevation for a significant period of time, you are probably going to be affected more by that rapid ascent. Other things that are going to affect you: are you tired? Are you eating well? Do you have other stressors that are going on that are complicating or that are impacting your ability to manage those the altitude? Okay, next we get into the disturbance stage. This occurs between 15,000 and 20,000 feet. This is the elevation at which most people are no longer able to compensate without assistance, primarily oxygen. At this altitude, our vision starts to be degraded. We might speak slower. We might have slurred speech. People who are not used to this altitude may appear drunk. Your coordination is going to be affected. Your reaction time is going to be affected. Your judgment is going to be affected. And this is that stage at which you probably want to be on oxygen if you're flying in an unpressurized cabin. I'll make note. I do have it noted below, but just to, or I'll get to it in a little bit. But just to kind of inject this right now, let's see, what is it? Part 135-89 of the CFR of the regulations, Code of Federal Regulations for air medical transport, says that all crew members, when flying above 10,000 feet for greater than 30 minutes, must be on oxygen. And if you're flying at an altitude greater than 12,000 feet, you got to be on oxygen for any period of time. So if you're flying in flying for one of these services, and again, this is in an unpressurized cabin. So where I fly, we have a manifold system set up so that the crew members can just quickly slap on a nasal cannula and get a little bit of supplemental oxygen. Okay, so very important to remember. Right. So, and then the next stage is the critical stage. It's greater than 20,000 feet. At this point, most people cannot function for any length of time without supplemental oxygen. There's generally a rapid onset of confusion, and if not addressed, this can lead to loss of consciousness and death. Wow. Not nearly as many people as I was hoping were going to be hopping on here. I had a lot of really good feedback, but anyway, this will be available to people who want to follow up after the fact on YouTube. You can watch it there, and I'll probably also share it on my website as well. Again, flightcrit.com. That's where you can find all kinds of great information that I'm putting out there about passing the FPC exam. I also have coaching on there that you can sign up for, and right on. Okay, we're going to move on to the next stage here, the next topic here in just a minute. All right, time of useful consciousness. This is another factor that they need to consider. And there are questions on the exam concerning the time of useful consciousness. So the time of useful consciousness, what is this? This is basically pertaining to pressurized cabins with a rapid decompression. Okay, and this is the amount of time from the onset of the rapid decompression to the point at which you lose your ability to correct the situation. So you're not necessarily unconscious, but you've now become so incapacitated that you can't protect yourself. You cannot address or manage the crisis. And this is assuming, these numbers that I'm about to give you are assuming good physical health and good rest. And it's important to realize that if you are fatigued or you are sick, then these numbers can be reduced by up to 50%. Okay, time versus altitude at around 20,000 feet with a rapid decompression. you've got about 30 minutes of useful consciousness. At that point, you're in trouble. At 25,000 feet, you have approximately 3 to 5 minutes. Now, there's a significant decrease here, and there's a good reason for this. We're going to talk about the gas laws here in a little bit, but we're going to talk about Dalton's law and Graham's law, I think, is the other one that kind of plays into effect here. But essentially, at 25,000 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen in your blood exceeds the partial pressure of oxygen at your alveolar level. Okay, so what happens? We know that oxygen moves by diffusion from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. When you suddenly have lower pressure outside the lung, you're going to get an active transport of oxygen out of the blood into the alveoli, and you'll be breathing it out. So that's why you have this rapid decrease in time of useful consciousness once you reach that 25,000 foot mark. At 35,000 feet with a rapid decompression, you have less than a minute, approximately 30 seconds to 60 seconds of time of useful consciousness. And at 45,000 feet, you have between 10 and 15 seconds. If you notice when you travel on an airliner, they generally say we'll be traveling at about 35,000 feet. I have no idea if this has anything to do with that, but I can hypothesize that is intended to give the pilots a chance to get down before they were to lose consciousness in the event of a rapid decompression. Should you have a rapid decompression at these high elevations, the most important thing to do is provide yourself supplemental oxygen that is going to extend your useful consciousness, and then the pilot will rapidly descend to below 10,000 feet. Okay. So combating the effects of hypoxia. Try to remember the DEATH acronym, DEATH. These are things to avoid that will improve your ability to manage the effects of hypoxia. So D stands for drugs, avoid drugs. And that's not just illicit drugs, but that's... That was our new cat. So drugs can affect your ability to manage hypoxia in any number of ways. Of course, exhaustion, stay well rested. Alcohol affects your ability to stay alert and combat the effects of hypoxia. Tobacco, primarily because of the carbon monoxide, again, prevents your hemoglobin from binding oxygen, but then also releasing oxygen, and then hypoglycemia. I already mentioned the 14 CFR Part 135-89. You can look that up. But again, that says crew members must be on oxygen if flying over 10,000 feet for greater than 30 minutes, and must be on oxygen anytime they're over 12,000 feet. All right. Does anybody have any questions before we get on to the next stress of flight, which is going to be thermal changes? Any questions? No chat comments, no questions. Okay. Well, I want to tell you guys thank you for hanging with me. We're going to be moving right along here. This broadcast may go over an hour. We've got some great information I don't want you to lose. Okay. All right. Moving on to our next stress of flight, we got thermal changes. And we're going to bang through these next stressors of flight pretty quickly because there's not a whole lot we can do about a lot of them, and they're just not as in depth as hypoxia, and they're just not covered as heavily on the exam, but they do show up from time to time. Okay, so the first one, thermal changes. Big problem with thermal changes is it increases our energy consumption, and it can affect clotting. We all know that trauma patients who are hypothermic bleed. So we need to make sure that we're keeping not only our patients warm and cool, but ourselves, primarily for the thermal, for the fatigue factor. According to the CAMES, they require documentation of corrective measures if the cabin temperature is less than 50 degrees or greater than 95. I don't know if that will actually show up on the exam, but there are CAMES questions. And so that is definitely being focused on heavily by CAMES lately. So I throw that in there because that may show up on your test. The next one is vibration. Vibration is a really big issue in helicopters. Not so much, I would say, in the fixed wing flights. Although I have been in a few turboprops that are pretty not that smooth. But vibration causes fatigue. That's the big thing. I've noticed it significantly, even between aircrafts. I fly in two different aircrafts. One of them is an Augusta 109. It's a twin engine, and it's got quite a bit of vibration. The newest aircraft that I've been flying in is the A-Star B3, and it just seems to be a lot more smooth. So some of those things you just don't have any effect or any control over. What you can do is limit your contact with the aircraft frame and use good cushioning. If you are in an aircraft that's got poor seat cushions or whatnot, have your mechanics swap those things out. And that's a safety factor. If you're becoming more fatigued because you're coming into contact with the aircraft, that's a problem. Same goes for your patient. If you've got those big patients, try to prevent them from leaning against the side of the airframe. All right. Dehydration is another big one. There have been reports of cabin humidity or cabin RH being as low as 1% on extended transports of within a pressurized cabin. And so keep that in mind. Low humidity increases fatigue, and it doesn't only just affect patients in a pressurized cabin. When you're flying at high altitude, the humidity also decreases. Air conditioning units, in most aircraft, that's how they cool the cabin, is through evaporation, and that's, of course, going to decrease the humidity in the cabin. Ventilators, just by their nature, have a tendency to extract moisture from the air that you're providing to a patient. So keep that in mind. It can have a significant effect on the circulating fluid volume of your patient. We lose, it's liters, I think. I think the majority of the fluid that we lose each day is through digestion and through ventilation. And I think just respiration has the greatest effect on fluid loss. So how can we manage this? Provide humidified O2 to your patient, whether that's through a bubbler, if they're on a nasal cannula. You can throw an HME. If you're not familiar with an HME, it's a heat and moisture exchanger. It's a little device that you throw on between the end tidal CO2 and the ET tube for ventilated patients, and it just keeps that moisture and that warmth inside their lungs. And then for crew members, just hydrate. I know I'm sitting here drinking coffee, so that's not the best thing. But I don't go back to work until tomorrow, and I'll be hydrating the rest of the day, and I drink liters each day when I'm on shift. Okay, next stress is noise. This is the big one. CAMES, I believe, recommends it. I don't think it's a requirement, but I think most flight services out there are requiring the use of hearing protection and helmets in the flight environment. The FAA has done a study and looked at the noise level in various aircrafts, and I will be including the results of that study in a little box in the PDF that'll be available on the website once this broadcast is done. But most excuse me. Most helicopters range from 90 to 110 decibels inside the cabin. That is enough to cause permanent hearing loss and leads to a significant amount of fatigue. It is recommended that both crew members and patients wear hearing protection. Of course, we all know that it's very difficult to provide adequate hearing protection to patients who are immobilized with their head blocked. But some things you can do is stuff earplugs, foam earplugs in. You can roll up gauze pads and tape that over their ears, but just do what you can. It is recommended that crew members wear both earmuffs as well as earplugs to protect their hearing. Now, of course, a lot of what I've been talking about, these different stressors of flight result in fatigue, but fatigue itself is a stressor of flight. And there are many effects, or many causes for fatigue beyond just these other stressors. Sleep deprivation, routine shift work when you're not, that occurs in between calls, doing base chores and QA and all that stuff. PRs effect, that's a big one. A lot of the time the PRs happen when you're out in the sun, or in the summer when it's hot. It's just simply shift work is another thing that affects fatigue. I know a lot of us work these 12, 24, 48-hour shifts, like I said previously, and it's just so important to make sure that we're getting adequate rest. Even intense periods of concentration. If you are running back-to-back flights and you're dealing with complicated patients, that's going to have a toll on you. That's going to cause increased fatigue. So you got to be aware of that, and you've got to take steps to combat that fatigue. The FAA 14 CFR 135.271 does require that even air medical crew members get 8 hours of rest prior to a shift. Now, I think that does not specifically say sleep time. It just means rest, and that can mean, and what most employers take it to mean, is just time away from work. Some other recommendations for combating the effects of fatigue is just take short and frequent naps. If you're on shift, I know we have a policy that we try to take naps in the middle of the afternoon if we're not flying. You want to avoid what they call sleep inertia, and that is where your body gets in these deep stages of REM sleep, where if you were to then wake up, you end up feeling more fatigued. So generally what I'll do is I'll take a 45-minute nap a couple times throughout the day. Don't quite get into that really deep rest, but it does have a profound effect on my fatigue level. And then the final stage of our stressor of flight are G-forces. And we're not going to touch too much on this, but because it doesn't really have a whole lot of effect on crew members, but it does have more of an effect on our patients. The direction of the G-forces has a greater effect than the amount of G-forces. Generally, in our environment, we don't experience great deal of G-forces. Maybe if you're doing a lot of fixed wing flights and during takeoff, but things to consider would be a patient's pathology and how you might position them in the aircraft if you have the ability to reposition them. So something that you might think about is the majority of the G-forces are on takeoff and ascent. So if you've got a patient with a big head injury, you may want their head towards the nose of the aircraft so that during that takeoff phase and during the ascent, the blood's not being forced to their head, it's being forced to their feet and helping reduce their ICP. So, okay, that's it for stresses of flight. Just do a quick recap. We had hypoxia, we had thermal changes, we had vibration, we had dehydration, we have noise, we have fatigue itself, and then the G-forces. Those are the stresses of flight, and the points that I hit on are the big ones that you'll see pop up on the exam. Okay, any questions on that before we get going? I'm going to just give a few moments for people to post their questions. Jason, I hope you're still on. If not, hey, hopefully you're getting some value out of this when you watch the replay. Any questions? Okay, no questions. Moving on to gas laws. Yes, our favorite. Everybody loves gas laws. We're going to be talking about the majority of the gas laws. We're going to be going over Boyle's law, Dalton's law, Charles' law, Henry's law, and Graham's law. So those are the biggest ones. You have to know those for the exam. Some you need to know more than others. The first two that we're going to touch on are Boyle's law and Dalton's law. Those two you have to know cold. Those are the two that show up on the exam every single time. And you have to be able to apply those. So if you missed my first Flight Crit Friday broadcast on the introduction to the FPC exam, go back and watch that one. I talk about why it's so important to really understand these concepts, not just be able to regurgitate them. Okay, so Boyle's law. We're going to start off with Boyle's law. So Boyle's law, balloon. Yeah, Boyle's balloon. Just remember balloon. Boyle's balloon. I'm going to say that again. Say that a few more times to kind of pound that into your head. Boyle's balloon. Okay, what happens when a balloon goes up in the air? I watched the, what was it called? Jump from Space. It was the Felix Baumgartner dude. It was a Red Bull promotion where this guy rode in a capsule up to the fringe of the stratosphere and jumped out and skydived back to Earth. And the thing you notice is this gigantic balloon that carried him up into space. As he got higher and higher, it got larger and larger. So as balloons rise, they become larger. Why is that? Well, Boyle's law says that as the volume in a volume goes up as PSI, or as pressure goes down, given a set volume, if you are, or set temperature. There you go, set temperature. So the way you would, let's see if I can, let me show you the way Boyle's law might be written on an exam. You'll have P1 over P2 is equal to V2 over V1. All right, so that's how Boyle's law, let me write that down. Boyle's law, all right? P1 over P2 equals V1 over V2. As the pressure goes down, volume goes up. Vice versa, as pressure goes down. Did I already say that? Pressure goes down, volume goes up. Pressure goes up, volume goes down. Okay? So why do we care about this? Okay, well, think about it. You're taking a patient from a certain altitude. You're going to put them into a helicopter. You're going to put them into an airplane, and you're going to fly up to a higher altitude. ET cuffs, okay, they're going to expand. If somebody's got a pneumo, whether it be a pneumocephalus, tension pneumo or pneumothorax, pneumomediastinum, anywhere they've got trapped air in their body is going to be affected by these pressure changes. So you have to be aware of that. That may be a cause to tell your pilot, hey, I need you to fly as low as possible. Or if you're in a pressurized cabin, hey, how low can you dial in the pressure? Okay, you need to be aware of that. Other things that might be affected by Boyle's law is Foley's, NG tubes, etc. So Boyle's law, just think of balloon. As the balloon goes up, the air pressure drops, the balloon gets bigger. Okay. The next one is Dalton's law. Dalton's law is the law of partial pressure, and this is a law that tells us the amount of oxygen we breathe in stays the same no matter what our altitude is. But it also tells us that we need to deliver more oxygen for higher altitudes because of partial pressure. So the law of partial pressure. Dalton's law equals the total pressure, PT. Okay? PT is equal to P1 plus P2 plus Pn. Okay? P1 plus P2 plus Pn equals PT. Okay? Basically what that says is the total partial pressure of a gas is equal to the sum of all the partial pressures of its constituents or its parts. Okay? So we know that oxygen, roughly 21% oxygen, what is it, like 78% nitrogen, and 1% of other stuff. Okay, and so that percentage doesn't change. Okay, but how do we figure out what the partial pressure of oxygen is? Well, you multiply the atmospheric pressure, okay, because that's the pressure that we're starting with, the atmospheric pressure, by 0.21, and that's going to give you the partial pressure of oxygen in the air we're breathing. Now, that does not mean that that is the partial pressure of the oxygen at the alveoli. That is actually reduced because of water vapor pressure and CO2, increased level of CO2 in the alveoli. What we know is that the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level under normal atmospheric conditions, we use 760 torr as our baseline, that we have a partial pressure of about 160 torr of oxygen. Well, now because of vapor pressure and CO2 at the alveoli, we get about 105. I think it's right around 105 is the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs, in the alveoli, 104, 105, something like that. Okay, so take into consideration you've got a patient that you take from altitude. Now you climb up to 5,000-6,000 feet. Maybe you're at sea level and you put them into a pressurized cabin. Now most pressurized cabins are pressurized between 6,000 and 8,000 feet. So now you have that reduction in atmospheric pressure, and there is a graph, and I will also include that in our notes, in the show notes. So when you come on over to the site, flightcrit.com, and look at the blog, you'll see those show notes. You'll be able to download. You'll see some of those show notes. I'm not sure if I'm going to put it on the blog or if it's just going to be a download that you can get. But that chart will be in there, and it's going to tell you generally how much atmospheric pressure drops per 1,000 feet of elevation. But we do know that as you go up in elevation, the atmospheric pressure drops. Does that mean the concentration of oxygen drops? No, it's still 21%. But the partial pressure of oxygen is going to go down because it's now 21% of whatever the lower atmospheric pressure is. And that's very important to realize. On my blog at flightcrit.com, I do have a post that talks about the two gas laws, Boyle's and Dalton. You can go over there and you can look at that, and I break down and really show you exactly how to figure out how much additional oxygen a patient will need depending on how high, how much elevation gain you're going to take them, you're going to subject them to. Okay, so Dalton's law, the law of partial pressure, PT equals P1 plus P2 plus Pn. Okay, the next one is Charles' law. And for Charles, just think Celsius. C is for Celsius. Okay, it's the law of temperature. Okay, basically what it says is as the temperature goes down, the pressure goes down. And as the temperature goes up, the pressure goes up, assuming a standard volume. Okay, now this doesn't have a whole lot of effect on our patients, but what this does affect is the aircraft performance. And if you've been flying for any length of time, or you're getting ready to, or you're preparing to flight, or to transition into flight, you'll hear the term density altitude. Density altitude is a term that pilots will use to talk about, how does the aircraft perform at the current altitude under the current atmospheric conditions, specifically temperature and humidity. I'm not going to try and explain how humidity affects the density altitude because, to be honest with you, I don't know. I've tried to understand it, but I struggle to understand it. But I do know that temperature does affect it. So as the temperature goes up, the pressure goes up. But think of the density of the air goes down, right? Because the air expands, the molecules are farther apart. The air is less dense. and so the aircraft doesn't perform as well. So, even though we may start off at 7,000 feet where I'm flying now, if it's really hot, the density altitude may be 8,500 feet. And so the aircraft is going to perform like it's at a higher altitude. Okay, so Charles' law, C is for Celsius. Okay, Henry loves his Heineken beer. Henry's law, Henry Heineken. All right, Henry's law says that the amount of gas dissolved in a solution is proportional to the pressure of the gas above it. Okay, what does that really mean? What it means is that gas wants to be in equilibrium. Okay, just think about equilibrium. If the pressure pushing down is equal to the pressure pushing up, there's no movement. Okay, so you take your beer, your Coke, whatever it might be, and you pop that top. Okay, and suddenly you get a fizz. You get all that the CO2 gas bubbles out of it. Why is that? That's because when those bottles are packaged, they're pressurized. They're pressurized with carbon dioxide, and then they put the cap on. And so there's more CO2 inside the liquid than is in the space above the liquid. Okay. Now, you got that cap, it's on there snug, and CO2 is going to diffuse out of that beer, and it's going to collect in that little space between the cap and the top of the beer. And at some point, the amount of CO2 that's in that little space is going to equal what's in the liquid, and you're not going to get any more release. But now suddenly you take that top off, and now you are exposing your beer to the atmospheric pressure, okay? The partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere is very little compared to the partial pressure of the CO2 in the beer, and that's why it bubbles, and that's why over time it goes flat. If you're like me, I like nitro beer, okay? I hope you like nitro beer. Nitro stout, that's my favorite. If you notice, a nitro beer does not go flat nearly as fast as a regular beer. Why? Think about it. What's the percentage of nitrogen in our atmosphere? 71% or 78%. 78%. So you've got a greater partial pressure of nitrogen pushing down on the nitrogen that's in that beer. So you have less release of the nitrogen from the beer. So therefore it doesn't go flat. It stays fizzier longer. Okay? And that's all because of Henry's law. Okay. Now, how does this affect our patient? Well, decompression sickness is the biggest one that we think about when we think about scuba divers that have gone down. They've been down for a while. Higher pressure, from the water, right? Higher atmospheric pressure, and there is a way. There is a calculation for the number of atmospheres that a person is subjected to when they go below the sea level, and I'll also put that in the PDF. Make a note of that. Okay, and so it forces more nitrogen into your tissue, right? You're breathing that in, it goes into your lungs, it's inert, but it diffuses into your tissue. Now, when you come back up and you're no longer subjected to those higher atmospheric pressures, now, that nitrogen is going to diffuse out of your tissue. Well, if it diffuses out of your tissue too fast, gets into your bloodstream, gives you the bends. Okay. Same can go for very large patients. So if you have a patient with a very high BMI, okay, their fat holds nitrogen much more than muscle or regular tissue. So if you have somebody who is very large, it's highly recommended, and you're going to be taking them from a low altitude to a very high altitude, and there's going to be a drastic change in excuse me, that pressure. You better be hyperoxygenating them before you put them in that aircraft and take them up to altitude, because they will off-gas nitrogen. They can have nitrogen narcosis, they can have the bends, and it can really cause you problems. So high flow, non-rebreather, really super oxygenate them ahead of time. and that will help your patients. Okay, so that is Henry's law. All right, Graham's law. Graham's law we'll talk just briefly about. Graham's law is the law of gaseous diffusion, and this is the law that tells us that that gas is going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and vice versa. Well, no, sorry. It's going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and that is how oxygen moves from our alveoli into our blood, and from our blood into our tissue, and vice versa, how CO2 diffuses from our tissue into our blood, and from our blood into our alveoli for off-gassing. Okay? And that's really all you need to know. Moves by a pressure gradient. And the pressure gradient is affected by concentrations. All right. That is it for gas laws. Just to recap, we have Boyle's law. Remember Boyle's balloon. We have Dalton's law, and I don't have a good way to remember this, but Dalton's law is the law of partial pressure. This is PT equals P1 plus P2 plus PN, P3, P4, P5, P6, whatever. We have Charles' law. Think of Charles in Celsius or temperature. We have Henry's law, Henry's Heineken, all right, and Graham's law. Okay. Last thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the physiologic atmospheric zones. Okay, our atmosphere is divided into a series of zones. Okay, and these zones have several names. They have traditional names like troposphere, which is the lower level, and that's so that's like ground. It's like 0 up to 10 miles. I think it's like 35,000 meters, I think is exactly what that is. And but we don't really need to know about that. I mean, troposphere is the zone within the atmosphere that we operate within. We're never going to be operating beyond that, and of course we're going to be operating much lower in the very lower skin of the troposphere. Okay, but what is important for you to realize is the physiologic or how these different zones can be are classified physiologically. Okay, so you've got and okay, so basically from 0 to 10,000 feet, you have this physiologic efficient zone. Okay, and that's what it's called, physiologic efficient. This is the zone at which we operate most of the time, and this is the zone within the atmosphere that humans can function without a whole lot of problems. Okay, so from 10,000 feet up to 50,000 feet, this is what we call the physiologic deficient zone, and this is that zone where oxygen is required, especially when you get above that 15,000 foot mark. Okay, this is called the physiologic zone, or the physiologic deficient zone. Beyond that, you've got what's called the space equivalent, and this stretches from 50,000 feet up to 100. Well, a couple sources say like 120 miles. Other sources say 1,000 miles. So really, it's irrelevant. We're never going to be here, but this is called the space equivalent zone. This is that zone which you can't survive. And then beyond that is space. So you've got the physiologic efficient zone and the physiologic deficient zone. Those are kind of the two zones that you need to be aware of. Physiologic efficient goes from sea level to 10,000 feet. The physiologic deficient zone goes from 10,000 feet to 50,000 feet. What else can I say about that? I think that's it. There will be a few other tips that I'm going to include on the PDF that will be available over at FlightCrit. When you go to FlightCrit, click on the resource tab at the top, and below that you will see Google Hangouts. Click there, and when you click on the replay of this broadcast, you will be offered a download PDF of my notes for this. I hope this was useful. If you did like it, I encourage you, please share this with everybody else that you know. The more people that I can get involved, the better this will be. Leave your comments over at flightcrit.com, or you can also leave your comments for the broadcast on Google+. And if you can also leave this over at the Flight Crit Facebook group. I want to thank you for your time this morning. We went over a little bit, but we also got started a little bit late. If you do like this, come over, sign up for my email newsletter. I will be, if you go over to flightcrit.com at the bottom of the page, you can sign up for my email newsletter. You can also send me a voice message using the SpeakPipe tool. In the very near future, I'm going to be launching the Flight Crit podcast, where I'll be talking about the preparations for the FPC exam, as well as all things flight EMS related. I'm going to be including your questions, the audio file for your questions in the broadcast, and I'll be sending out a special gift, a special thank you gift to those people who have their questions featured on the show. I also broadcast on Periscope, and if you're not familiar with Periscope, it is a app that you can download for your iPhone and also your Android phone. Periscope is owned by Twitter, so if you already have a Twitter account, then you already have a Periscope account. Follow me at FlightCrit on both Periscope and Twitter. Periscope, I do live broadcasts. You'll be notified on your phone, similar to this, but they're just kind of impromptu. I'll go on there. I'll talk about what I'm doing at work. I'll show, take you through setting up ventilators, just all kinds of stuff related to flight medicine. I'll just kind of do a little impromptu training session. So it's super valuable. And then follow me on Twitter. Please, if you like this, share it. Tell your friends. Tell them to follow me at FlightCrit on Twitter and on Periscope. Come on over to facebook.com/FlightCrit. You can join the community there. There's both a page where I announce what's going on, announce these broadcasts. There's also a group where people interact and share their ideas and strategies and tips for flight medicine. And especially come on over to flightcrit.com. Sign up for my email newsletter. If you would like to actually participate in the conversation, right down here at the bottom of your screen, it says me right now, it says you. I can have up to 10 people in the broadcast. You can be a part. It's just like having a conversation. So I don't know if you've ever done a Google Hangouts on air, but you can actually be a part of the conversation. You can ask me questions, and it's a back and forth. It's a dialogue rather than me just talking to you. That way I really know that I'm giving you the information that you want. I'm answering your questions and really making this successful for you. So I'm going to hang on here for a few more minutes. If you do have further questions, ask them in the questions tab. I was hoping that a few more people would pop into the conversation, but you can also go over to YouTube and search for Flight Crit, and you'll find these broadcasts so you can watch them again later. Please give them a thumbs up or a plus sign. Wherever you are, if you like this, share this, give it a thumbs up, give it a like, and I sure hope that this was beneficial to you. Next week, what are we going to be doing next week? What do you want to do? What do you want to do next week? Let's see here. Airway management? Airway management is massive. What do we want to do next week? We want to do trauma? Airway? Let's see. I'll tell you what. Why don't you come on over? Here's what I want you to do. Okay? I want you to go to Google Plus and do a search for Flight Crit. You'll find my community there. Send me your comments of what you'd like me to cover next week. Or go over to Twitter and search for me there at Flight Crit. and tweet me your requests for next week's topic for the flight paramedic exam. And or you could come on over to flightcrit.com and send me a comment there. Okay. Again, this is going to be posted up on flightcrit.com under Google Hangouts. You can also find it at YouTube. And there will be a special PDF with the notes from this lecture available for you to download from the website. So go on over to flightcrit.com, download my notes, and rewatch the video, share it. And I want to thank you very much for joining us this morning. I really hope that this was beneficial. I hope you tune in next Friday, same time at 9 a.m. Mountain Time for Flight Crit Fridays. So thanks so much. Fly safe and live well. Bye-bye.